fork in Edward's hand had not moved for the last 3 minutes. He knew this because he had been watching the candle flame across the table flicker once, twice, a dozen times, and not a single bite had reached his mouth since the second course arrived. Around him, the dinner table hummed with conversation. His Uncle Geoffrey was telling a story about a golf trip that had gone wrong somewhere in Scotland, and the 2 older women to Edward's left were laughing in that polished, careful way people laugh when they are at someone else's estate and want to appear charming rather than genuinely amused. The silverware caught the light. The wine in his glass caught it too. Everything at that table caught the light, except Edward himself, who sat in the middle of all of it, feeling like a man waiting for a storm that only he could see coming. His full name was Edward Charles Ashworth, and the people in this room had called him the Duke since he was 7 years old, not because he held any official title, but because his grandfather had used the word once in a toast, and the family had never let it go. He was 31 now, broad-shouldered and quiet, with dark eyes that missed very little and a habit of sitting very still when he was thinking hard. People who did not know him well sometimes mistook that stillness for ease. The people who knew him at all understood that it meant the exact opposite. The estate belonged to his grandmother, Eleanor Ashworth, who sat at the far end of the table with the serene authority of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands, 4 business rivals, and 1 very public family scandal that no one at this table would ever name out loud. Eleanor was 81 years old and still wore her white hair swept back in a way that made her look both ancient and completely undefeated. She had arranged this dinner. She arranged most dinners of consequence in the Ashworth family. That was simply how things had always worked. Edward's cousin James sat beside him, younger by 4 years, and easier in the world, in a way that Edward had always quietly admired. James had the kind of face that made strangers feel comfortable, open, and a little amused by everything, and he was currently using that face to charm the young woman seated across from him, whose name Edward could not remember, despite having been introduced to her twice this evening. James was good at this. He was good at nearly everything that required other people to like you on short notice. Edward was not. The problem was not the dinner. The problem was not the uncle's golf story, or the polished laughter, or even his grandmother's careful eyes that occasionally swept the table like a lighthouse beam, missing nothing. The problem was that Edward had made a decision 3 weeks ago, and tonight was the night that decision had to be acted on. And the clock on the wall above the sideboard showed that he was already 12 minutes behind the plan he had put together, with such careful thought in the quiet of his own flat. Clara was waiting. He had not told anyone at this table about Clara, except James, and he had told James only enough to make the situation understood without giving him the full shape of it. James knew there was a woman. James knew that Edward felt strongly about her. James suspected, correctly, that the Ashworth family would have a reaction to this woman that would be difficult and probably loud. What James did not know was that Clara was currently parked in her small blue car, half a mile down the narrow country road that wound past the estate's east gate, engine off, sitting in the dark with the radio playing low, waiting for Edward to walk out of this dinner and into the beginning of the rest of his life. That was the plan. Get through the first course. Get through the second. Make a quiet, reasonable excuse, perhaps a headache, perhaps a work call that simply could not wait, and then walk to the front door, take the coat from the hook 3 steps to the left of it, and keep walking until the estate lights were behind him, and the night air was cool on his face, and Clara's headlights appeared at the end of the road, like something he had been waiting for without knowing it. It was a good plan. It was a clean plan. He had gone over it so many times in the past week that it had stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling like something that had already happened, something he was simply replaying in his memory rather than preparing to do for the first time. And then James had leaned across the table during the soup course and said something very quietly into the side of Edward's head that had changed every single thing. Edward had not responded. He had not moved. He had simply set down his soup spoon with great care, the way you set down something fragile when you are trying not to let anyone see that your hands have started to shake. And he had looked at the candle flame across the table, and he had begun counting the flickers. The thing James had told him was this: their mother had arrived. Not Eleanor, not the grandmother, Edward's mother, Constance Ashworth, who had been introduced to the guests at the beginning of the evening as feeling unwell, resting upstairs, who sends her warmest regards and hopes everyone enjoys the lamb. Constance, who had not been expected at this dinner at all, who had told Edward himself on the phone 2 days ago that she had a prior engagement in the city and would not be making the drive. Constance, who apparently, according to James, who had heard it from Eleanor's housekeeper Frances 20 minutes ago in the corridor near the kitchen, had arrived at the estate that afternoon. Not this evening. That afternoon, hours ago, and had gone straight upstairs, and had not come down, and had been described by Frances as very quiet and very focused, which were words that, when applied to Constance Ashworth, meant something quite specific and quite alarming. His mother being in this house changed things. His mother being in this house and already present before the dinner began, and choosing not to appear at the table, meant that she was waiting for something. Constance did not rest. Constance did not sit quietly upstairs while a family dinner happened below her, unless she had a reason to be quiet, and that reason almost always turned out to be that she was preparing something. Edward had spent the better part of his life understanding his mother the way sailors understand weather. Not because she was cruel, she was not cruel, and he had always known this, even in the moments when they stood on opposite sides of a conversation that felt like a wall. She was intelligent, and she was proud, and she loved the Ashworth name the way some people love a country, with a devotion so complete that it sometimes crowded out other things. She had raised Edward alone after his father left when Edward was 9, and she had done it with a discipline and a steadiness that he genuinely respected, and the two of them had found a way to be close, even through the years when they disagreed about almost everything that mattered. But this was different. If she knew about Clara, and James's 2-word warning suggested that she knew something, then tonight was not the quiet exit Edward had planned. Tonight was something else, something that required him to think very clearly, and move very carefully, and not make a mistake. He picked up his fork. He put a small piece of lamb in his mouth. He chewed. He swallowed. He looked at James, who was still talking to the young woman across the table, but whose eyes flicked briefly to Edward's face, with a question in them, and Edward gave the smallest possible shake of his head. Not yet. Not now. Wait. James understood this. That was one of the genuinely good things about James. The uncle's golf story reached what appeared to be its conclusion, drawing polite applause from the end of the table near Geoffrey's wife, a small woman named Patricia who always appeared slightly surprised to be wherever she was. Eleanor smiled without quite laughing, which was her way of acknowledging a story she had heard before. The young woman whose name Edward had forgotten said something bright and appreciative that made Geoffrey beam. The candles continued to burn. The second course was removed, and the third arrived, and still Edward's mind was running the same calculation over and over. What does she know? How did she find out? What is she going to do with what she knows? And is Clara still down the road, or has something happened? He had his phone in his pocket, and he thought about texting Clara, but he did not do it. Not yet. Not from the table. His grandmother noticed everything, and a man looking at his phone during a family dinner was the kind of small thing that somehow became a large thing by the time Eleanor had finished observing it. What Edward did do, quietly, without looking at what he was writing, was reach beneath the tablecloth and feel along the edge of his place setting until his fingers found the small folded card that had served as his place marker at the beginning of the evening. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, with his name in printed script on the outside. He turned it over. He held it steady against his knee with one hand and used the pen he always kept in his jacket pocket to write 4 words on the back of it, in letters, small enough that no one looking from a reasonable distance could read them. He passed the card to James without looking at him. Under the table, he felt James take it. There was a pause. Edward counted the seconds. 7, 8, 9. James's hand found his knee and pressed once, briefly. A question. Edward pressed back once in answer. Understood. 2 minutes passed. Geoffrey had moved on to a second story, this one involving a misunderstanding at a railway station somewhere in Europe, and the table had the warm, loose feeling of a group of people who were on their second or third glass of wine and beginning to enjoy themselves in the uncomplicated way that food and warmth produce in people who have no immediate reason to worry. Edward was the only person at that table with an immediate reason to worry. He watched the clock. He thought about the 4 words he had written on the card. He thought about Clara in the blue car in the dark, and about his mother upstairs, in one of Eleanor's guest rooms with the light on, and about the way this evening had been supposed to go, versus the way it was clearly going to go instead. and he felt something settle in his chest that was not quite calm, but was close to it. Whatever was coming, it was coming regardless of what he did next. He had understood that the moment James's words had landed in his ear, the question was not whether to face it, but how. And Edward had spent enough years being careful, being measured, being the version of himself that fit the room he was standing in, that he had an idea, not fully formed yet, but present, like the shape of something seen through fog, of what he wanted to do differently this time. He wanted to be honest. Not careful, not strategic, not measured, just honest. About Clara, about what she meant to him, about the fact that his life was not a thing that could be arranged by a table setting, or a family expectation, or a mother who loved him, and also, sometimes, loved the idea of him more than the actual person he was becoming. He picked up his wine glass and drank. James was laughing at something Jeffrey had said, and the laugh was real. Edward could tell the difference. And something about that small realness in the middle of this very arranged evening made Edward feel steadier than he had in hours. He set the glass down. He looked at the clock one more time. He had a decision to make, and he had already made it. He just had not yet found the moment to begin. That moment, it turned out, was closer than he thought. Because at that precise instant, without any sound that any of them had heard, the dining room doors opened, and the room shifted in the way rooms shift when someone enters who carries their own particular gravity. Edward did not turn around right away. He knew from the change in the table's atmosphere, the slight straightening of backs, the pause in Jeffrey's story, the way Eleanor's eyes moved to the doorway with an expression he had never quite seen on her face before, that it was his mother. And then she was in his peripheral vision, and then she was beside her chair, and then she sat, and she looked at Edward, and she looked at him with an expression that was completely unreadable, which was perhaps the most alarming thing she could possibly have done. "I hope I haven't missed anything important," Constance said, to the table, to no one in particular, to everyone. She was wearing her pearls. She had changed. She had come down from upstairs fully prepared, which meant she had not been resting. She had been getting ready. She had been waiting for this moment, just as Edward had been dreading it. The dinner continued around them. Forks moved. Conversation restarted. Jeffrey returned to his story. And Constance poured herself a glass of water and looked at the centerpiece with the expression of a woman who has already decided what she is going to say and is simply waiting for the correct moment to say it. Edward ate his third course. The candles burned lower. The clock moved forward. And somewhere down the dark road, a woman named Clara sat in a blue car with the radio playing low, and she waited, because she had promised to wait, and because she understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the things worth having are sometimes the things that require you to sit in the dark a little while longer before the light finds you. There was a particular sound that large old houses made after 10 o'clock, a kind of settling, like the walls were breathing out after holding themselves upright all day. The Ashworth estate made that sound beautifully. Eleanor had lived in it for so long that she no longer heard it, but Edward had always noticed it, ever since he was a child visiting in the summers and sleeping in the room at the end of the east corridor with the window that looked out over the garden. The house exhaled. The floorboards spoke to each other in low voices. The radiators made a sound like distant conversation in another room. He stood in the hallway outside the dining room, with his phone in his hand, and his heart doing something he could not entirely control. He had stepped out during the brief pause between the dessert and the coffee, the moment when people push back their chairs and stretch and move toward the other room, when his absence would not immediately register as meaningful. James had given him a look as he left, and Edward had answered it with a slight nod that he hoped communicated everything necessary. His phone showed 3 messages from Clara. The first had come 40 minutes ago. "Still here. Everything okay?" The second, 15 minutes later. "Getting a little cold. No rush though." The third, just 8 minutes ago, was only 3 words. "Take your time." He read them in order, and felt something he did not have an immediate name for. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief, or the specific feeling of being known by someone, in a way that does not put pressure on you. Clara never put pressure on him. That was one of the things he had noticed first about her, back in the beginning, when they had met at a small dinner party at a mutual friend's flat in the city, and she had been the only person in the room who was not trying to be interesting. She had simply been interested in the conversation, in the other people, in the food, in the question his friend had put to the table about whether happiness was a state or a practice. Clara had said, without any performance, that she thought it was closer to a habit than either, and the table had gone briefly quiet, in the way tables do when someone says something true. He typed, "Still here. Coming soon. Something's happened with my mother. Don't leave." He pressed send and stood in the hallway and breathed. Behind the dining room doors, he could hear the murmur of voices, the sound of chairs moving, the particular warm noise of people transitioning from sitting down to standing up. In a few minutes, they would all be in the drawing room with the coffee and the small chocolate biscuits that Eleanor's housekeeper Frances always arranged on a silver dish, and Edward's absence would become noticeable. He walked to the window at the end of the hallway and looked out at the dark garden. The lawn was pale in the moonlight. The old oak tree near the garden wall was a solid black shape against the lighter dark of the sky. Somewhere beyond the east gate, half a mile down the road, Clara was in her car, and Edward was in this hallway, and between them was the evening that had not gone according to plan. He thought about the card he had passed to James. "Pretend you're ill, and leave now." He had written it without fully thinking it through. A reflex. The instinct to get James out of the room before whatever happened next happened, to protect him from being caught in the middle of something he had not asked to be part of. But James had not left. James had stayed, because James understood that leaving was not actually what was needed here. The door at the far end of the hallway opened, and his mother walked through it. She was still wearing the pearls. Her shoes made a quiet, steady sound on the old wooden floor. She did not appear surprised to find him standing by the window, which meant she had either seen him leave the dining room or had expected him to be here. He was not sure which possibility was more unsettling. "I thought you might want some air," she said. She said it without any particular edge, which was how Constance operated. She removed the edges from her words so carefully that you sometimes did not notice they were still sharp until you had already stepped on one. "I was going to call someone," Edward said. "Work." "Of course," she said, and she stopped beside him at the window and looked out at the same dark garden he had been looking at, and they stood there for a moment, in the old house quiet, and the thing that needed to be said waited between them, like a third person in the hallway. It was Constance who ended the silence. She did it the way she did most difficult things, directly and without decoration. "I know about the young woman," she said. Edward had prepared for this. He had prepared for it in the 3 seconds since she had come through the door, and in the 20 minutes since James had warned him, and in a broader sense for the past 3 weeks since he had understood that this conversation would have to happen. He had prepared for it, and it still landed somewhere in his chest, with a weight he had not entirely expected. "Her name is Clara," he said. His mother turned to look at him. "I know her name," she said. That was interesting. He looked back at her. "How?" "Someone told me." She paused. "Several people told me, actually. You know how word travels in this family." He did know. The Ashworths were not a gossipy family in the common sense. They were too well-mannered for that. But they were a connected family, and information moved between them the way water moved through old stone, slowly, invisibly, and with surprising thoroughness. "I wasn't hiding it," Edward said. This was true, technically. He had not announced Clara to the family, but he had not made any effort to conceal her existence either. They had been to restaurants together, to the theater once, to a small gallery opening where 3 people who knew the Ashworth family had seen them, and said nothing at the time and, apparently, a great deal afterward. "I didn't say you were hiding it," his mother said. She moved to the small bench that sat against the hallway wall, the old wooden one with the embroidered seat that had been there for as long as Edward could remember, and she sat down on it with a composure that suggested she had decided this conversation would be a seated one. "I said I know about her. That's different." Edward leaned against the windowsill. Outside, a fox crossed the far corner of the garden, visible for a moment in the moonlight, and then gone. He watched the space where it had been. "What do you want to say?" he asked. "I want to know what you're planning," she said. "Not who is she, not what does she do, not is she appropriate. What are you planning?" His mother had always gone directly to the center of things. "I'm planning to be with her," Edward said. "Properly. Not in the way I've been doing it, which is careful and quiet, and designed not to inconvenience anyone. The other way, the real way." His mother looked at him for a long time. The hallway was quiet enough that he could hear the clock in the dining room through the closed doors. "Tonight?" she said. "That was the plan," he said, "before I knew you were here." She absorbed this without visible reaction, which was typical of her, and then she said, "Tell me about her." This surprised him. He had not expected this. He had expected argument, or concern, or the particular careful language his mother used when she disapproved of something, but was trying to frame the disapproval as a question, so that it would be harder to disagree with. He had not expected "tell me about her." He told her. He started slowly, feeling his way forward, and then he stopped being careful about it and simply talked. He told her how they had met, the dinner party, the conversation about happiness and habit. He told her what Clara did. She was an editor at a small but well-regarded publishing house in the city. She worked primarily with nonfiction. She had a gift for finding the center of an argument and helping writers understand what they were actually trying to say. He told her that Clara lived in a flat in Islington with too many books and a cat named Norman who disapproved of most people and had, inexplicably, decided that Edward was acceptable. He told her that Clara was funny in a way that did not announce itself, that she was kind without being soft, that she read constantly and had strong opinions about restaurants and weak opinions about films, which she watched enthusiastically but forgot almost immediately, which she herself found hilarious. He talked for longer than he intended. His mother listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on his face, and she did not interrupt him once. When he stopped, the hallway was very quiet. "She sounds," his mother said after a moment, "like someone worth being late to dinner for." He stared at her. She looked back at him with something in her expression that was not the unreadable thing from earlier. This was something else, something more complicated, something that might, if he was reading it correctly, have been a kind of relief. "I came early today," she said, "to the estate. I told your grandmother I wanted to settle in before the guests arrived." "Francis said you came in the afternoon," Edward said. "I did." She paused, and then she said something that changed the entire evening. "I wasn't resting. I was thinking. I do my best thinking in this house. I always have, and I had something that needed thinking about." "What?" he asked. She looked at him with a steadiness that he recognized, that he had grown up recognizing, the look of a woman who had made a decision and was now delivering it with full intent. "I wanted to decide," she said, "how to tell you that I am willing to try." The fox reappeared at the edge of the garden, stopped at the center of the lawn, and looked toward the house with bright small eyes, before vanishing again into the dark. Edward did not speak. He was not certain he could, just at that moment. "I'm not saying it will be easy," his mother continued. "I'm not saying I don't have concerns. I'm not saying this is all resolved, and you should go fetch the woman, and bring her to the drawing room for coffee. That is not what I'm saying." She paused. "What I'm saying is that I am willing to try, and that is more than I thought I would be saying an hour ago, so I would ask you to take it as the significant thing that it is." "It is," Edward said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. From behind the dining room doors, the sound of voices had moved. The coffee hour was underway in the drawing room now, which meant they had approximately 15 minutes before someone noticed the two of them were missing, and sent James to find them. "She's in her car," Edward said. "Down the road." His mother's expression shifted by a very small amount. "Right now?" "She's been there since before dinner." Constance looked at him for a moment, and then she did something he had not seen her do in a very long time. She laughed. It was a small laugh, short and quiet, but it was entirely real. "Well," she said, standing up from the bench and smoothing her dress in one practiced motion, "that is rather dedicated." "Yes," Edward said, "she is." His mother looked at him for another moment, and in that moment he saw something in her face that he did not always get to see, the version of her that was not performing composure or authority, or any of the things that Constance Ashworth was required to be. Just the version that was his mother, looking at her son, trying to do the right thing by him, even when it was not the comfortable thing. "Go back into the drawing room," she said. "Have coffee. Be present for the next hour. That's all I'm asking. And then you can go." "And Clara?" he said. "Text her," his mother said simply. "Tell her to keep the engine off. She's been patient this long." He almost smiled. He did not quite manage it, but it was close. He reached into his pocket and found his phone, and his mother walked back toward the drawing room, with her quiet, steady steps, and the old house breathed around them both. And outside in the dark garden, the moon had moved behind a cloud, so that the lawn was entirely black. And somewhere down the road, a blue car sat with a woman in it, who had said she would wait, and who had meant it. He typed his message to Clara, with his back against the cold glass of the window, and the hallway clock ticking in the silence. "1 more hour," he wrote. "Then I'm coming. And there's something I need to tell you." He pressed send. He put the phone in his pocket. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the drawing room. He was ready, now, for whatever the next hour held. Clara had known the evening would not go smoothly. She had not known this through any specific information or advance warning. She had simply known it the way people know things about the people they care about, through accumulated observation, through the habit of paying attention. Edward was not a man who found things easy. He was a man who found them worth doing, which was different, and sometimes more admirable. But it meant that almost nothing in his life arrived without some resistance first. She had known him for 7 months now, which was long enough to understand his silences, and short enough to still find them interesting. He was quieter than most people she spent time with, and he thought about things for longer before he said them, and sometimes the gap between what he was thinking and what he finally said was wide enough that she had learned to wait for the full version, rather than trying to guess at the beginning of it. She had always been patient. Her mother had called it one of her better qualities. Her older brother, Will, had called it a personality defect, disguised as a virtue, which was the kind of thing Will said about people he was fond of. The car was cold. She had dressed for an evening that was supposed to have started 2 hours ago, and the coat she was wearing was the right coat for walking from a car park to a restaurant in the city, but was perhaps not quite sufficient for sitting still in a country lane in October after nightfall. She had the heater running for 10 minutes in every half hour, which she had decided was a reasonable compromise between staying warm and not running the fuel down to a level that would become embarrassing. She had the radio on, quietly, a late music program. The presenter had a voice like someone explaining something they genuinely cared about, and Clara found that comforting. She had a book in her bag, a manuscript actually, something she had brought from work intending to read on the train, and had not gotten to, and she had read 12 pages of it, before the light became too uncertain to continue comfortably. The 12 pages had been good. The author had a gift for the first sentence of every paragraph, a quality she always noticed because so few writers understood how much work those opening words were doing. Her phone lit up with Edward's message. She read it twice. 1 more hour. Then I'm coming. And there's something I need to tell you. She sat with this for a moment. Something I need to tell you. That was either good or it was complicated. And with Edward, those two things were not always distinct from each other. She had learned that too. The things he found most important to say were also the things that required the most effort to say, and the effort was always visible on him, in the way he held his jaw, and the particular stillness he went into before a difficult sentence. She typed back, "Okay, I'm here." She put the phone in her bag and looked at the road. The country lane was empty in both directions, which she had expected. It was not the kind of road that had much traffic at this hour, or really at any hour, being the sort of narrow, hedged-in road that existed primarily to connect one old estate to another, and was used mostly by people who already knew exactly where they were going. The hedges on either side were dark, solid walls in the headlights of passing cars that never actually passed. The sky above them was very wide and very clear, the kind of sky you could not see in the city, crowded with stars that had been there all along and simply required darkness to become visible. Clara was 30 years old, and she had spent the last 5 years in the city, and she did not often find herself in places dark enough to see that many stars. She put the window down a few inches despite the cold, tipped her head back against the headrest, and looked up through the gap at the narrow strip of sky above the lane. She thought about Edward. She thought about the first time they had met, at Lucy's dinner party, in Lucy's small and very full flat in Notting Hill, where there had not been quite enough chairs, and everyone had ended up on cushions on the floor by the end of the evening, which Lucy had predicted, and in fact, arranged on purpose, by buying fewer chairs than she needed. Lucy believed in people sitting on floors together. Clara had been skeptical of this theory until that evening, when sitting on the floor with her plate in her lap and her back against the sofa, had produced a conversation with a man named Edward, who had been introduced to her as a financial analyst, but turned out to be someone who had very strong opinions about maps of all things. Not directions, not navigation, maps. The history of them, the choices cartographers made, what it meant to draw the world as if you understood it. She had asked him 3 questions, and he had unfolded into the subject like a door opening. She had gone home that night and told her friend Mia about him, and Mia had said, immediately, "You like him," not as a question. And Clara had said, "I don't know yet." And Mia had said, "Yes you do. You just described a man's opinions about maps for 4 minutes," which was fair. He had texted her the next day. Not immediately. She had half expected immediately, which was how most people operated now. The instant contact, the reaching out before the evening was even over. Edward had texted her the next day, in the early afternoon, and the text had been 2 sentences. "I forgot to ask what you thought about the question on happiness and habit. I've been thinking about what you said." She had read it on her lunch break, sitting at her desk with half a sandwich, and she had thought, this one is different. 7 months, and now she was in a country lane in October, waiting for him to walk out of his grandmother's estate and tell her something he needed to tell her, and she was not afraid of what it might be, which was itself something worth noting. She had been afraid in other situations, with other people, the specific fear of not knowing what was coming next, the bracing quality of relationships that kept you constantly uncertain. With Edward she was not afraid. She was interested. There was a difference, and it mattered. Her phone buzzed. Not a text, a call. She picked it up and looked at the screen, expecting Edward's name, and found instead the name that appeared above a number she had been given 3 weeks ago and had not used since. Constance Ashworth. She stared at it for a moment. Then she answered. "Hello," she said. "Miss Carter." The voice was measured, entirely composed, the voice of a woman who had spent decades being the most controlled person in any given room. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Clara said, which was true. "Good." A brief pause. "I won't keep you long. I simply wanted to say something, and I thought it was better said before the evening ended rather than after." Clara waited. "When we met," Constance said, 3 weeks ago, you came to me, you'll recall, without Edward's knowledge. I've thought a great deal about why you did that. I wanted to understand," Clara said, "before things went further. I thought it would be better if I understood your position, rather than finding out through Edward after the fact." "That was either very intelligent or very brave," Constance said. "I haven't entirely decided which." "Maybe both," Clara said, quietly. A small pause. "Maybe both," Constance agreed. "What I want to say is this. Edward does not know that I came to this dinner with a different intention than the one he is expecting. He thinks I am here to object. He is bracing for that. I came here, in fact, to tell him something different, and I wanted you to know that, because I think you deserve to know it before he walks out of this house tonight." Clara's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "He's going to be all right," Constance said. "The conversation he's afraid of is not the conversation he's actually going to have. I want you to know that, so that the next hour is less difficult for both of you." Clara sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the stars were very clear. "Thank you," she said. "That means a great deal." "It means something to me as well," Constance said, and the way she said it was careful, but not cold, more like someone setting down something heavy they had been carrying for a while, and finding that the ground was solid. "I will see you properly, I imagine, at some point in the not-too-distant future." "I hope so," Clara said. "Good night, Miss Carter." "Good night." The call ended. Clara sat in the dark lane with the phone in her lap and the stars overhead, and she felt the evening rearrange itself around her, all the tense waiting hours of it reshaping into something she had not quite anticipated. She reached into her bag and found the manuscript she had been reading, and opened it to page 13, and held it up toward the moonlight coming through the windscreen. Not quite enough light to read by, but she tried anyway, because there was still an hour to go, and she had always found that reading in uncertain conditions was better than not reading at all. The author's sentences were good. She turned the page. The drawing room at the Ashworth estate was the kind of room that seemed designed to make people feel that they should speak quietly and carry their coffee cups with both hands. It was not large enough to be grand, but it was old enough to be serious, with low dark bookshelves along 2 walls, and a fireplace that was lit on autumn evenings regardless of the actual temperature. The rugs were Persian, worn in a comfortable way that suggested they had been walked on by several generations of people who had important conversations, and the two sofas were deep and upholstered in a green that had once been bright and was now the exact color of serious thought. Edward stood near the fireplace with his coffee cup in one hand and his other hand in his jacket pocket, and watched his family arrange themselves across the room the way they always arranged themselves. His Uncle Geoffrey near the drinks table, his grandmother in the high-backed chair that was understood to be hers, James on the far sofa with the young woman whose name Edward had not yet caught, and his mother. His mother was at the window, looking out into the garden, and she had not looked at him since they came back in from the hallway. This was either entirely natural or a very deliberate choice, and with Constance, it was always hard to know which, so Edward defaulted to assuming the latter. Frances, the housekeeper, moved through the room with the silver dish of chocolate biscuits, offering them to each person with the specific efficient warmth of someone who had worked for Eleanor Ashworth long enough to know exactly how much warmth was appropriate, and not 1 degree more. Frances was one of those people who knew everything that happened in a house, and said nothing about any of it unless directly asked, in which case she would tell you the absolute minimum necessary, with the expression of someone providing emergency services. She had been at the estate for 22 years. Edward liked her very much. She paused beside him and offered the dish. He took a biscuit he did not intend to eat and said, quietly, "Frances." "Mr. Ashworth," she said. "When my mother arrived this afternoon," he said, keeping his voice low enough that it would not carry to the nearest sofa, "did she seem troubled?" Frances considered this for a moment, with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "She seemed decided," Frances said finally. "About what?" Frances looked at him with an expression that was not unkind. "I wouldn't know, sir. But decided was the word that came to mind." He thanked her. She moved on with the biscuits. Decided. That was something to think about. He ate the biscuit after all and looked at the fire, which was burning low and orange, and threw a warm, unsteady light across the nearest stretch of Persian rug. Outside the window, his mother stood with her back to the room, and Edward watched her reflection in the glass. She was looking at the garden just as he had been looking at it in the hallway an hour ago, at the same dark lawn and the same pale moonlight, and possibly the same fox, if it had made its way around to this side of the house. James appeared at his elbow in the quiet way James had of appearing, as though he had simply condensed from the general atmosphere of the room. "She's not angry," James said, without preamble. "I know," Edward said. "I can tell when she's angry. I've been watching her for 30 minutes. She's not angry. What is she?" James thought about this. He was, despite his easy manner and his talent for making strangers comfortable, a genuinely perceptive person, and Edward trusted his readings of situations more than he sometimes admitted. "She's working up to something," James said. "Not an argument, something else, something she's planned." He paused. "She came here with an agenda, Edward, not the agenda you think." "I know that too," Edward said. James looked at him. "She told you in the hallway. Some of it. What did she say?" Edward looked at his cousin. Outside the window, his mother turned away from the glass and looked across the room, and for a moment her eyes found Edward's, and in that moment, he saw in her face something that he recognized because he had put it there, or rather, because she had decided to let him see it, which amounted to the same thing. It was the look of a woman who had decided to stop holding something at arm's length and bring it closer. It was the look of someone who had, after a long time being careful, chosen to be a little brave. "She said she was willing to try," Edward said. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not nothing." "No," Edward said, "it isn't." From the high-backed chair, Eleanor spoke without raising her voice, in the way of people who have never needed to raise their voices to be heard. "Edward, come and sit with me." He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside hers. His grandmother looked at him with her pale, sharp eyes, and she did not say anything immediately, because Eleanor also did not rush. "You've had a difficult evening," she said finally. "It's gotten easier," he said. She made a small sound that might have been approval, or might have been skepticism. With Eleanor, it was genuinely hard to tell. "Your mother told me, when she arrived this afternoon, that she intended to do something difficult tonight." "What did she tell you exactly?" he asked. She told me, Eleanor said, smoothing the sleeve of her cardigan in a gesture he associated entirely with her, that she had spent 3 weeks making a decision, and that she was going to come here and make it properly, rather than making it over the telephone, which is where most cowardly decisions are made. She paused. I agreed with her on that point. Important things should be said in person. Edward looked at his grandmother. Did you know about Clara? I know about most things, Eleanor said simply, which was both entirely true and a complete non-answer, and she clearly knew it, because she added, I knew that you were serious about someone, and that your mother was concerned. I also knew that your mother's concerns were about things that could be worked through, rather than things that could not, which is an important distinction. She said she was willing to try, Edward said again. Yes, Eleanor said. She would be. She paused. She loves you. She's also afraid, which is a terrible combination, because it makes people say the wrong thing for a very long time before they work out what the right thing is. Your mother has had a long process of working that out, and she has managed it, and I think you should give her credit for that. He thought about the hallway, the settled way his mother had sat on the old embroidered bench, the steadiness with which she had said it, the small, real laugh when he had told her Clara was in her car down the road. She laughed, he said, when I told her Clara was waiting. Good, Eleanor said, with satisfaction. That means she was relieved. He looked at his grandmother. How do you always know these things? I've been watching people for 81 years, she said. Eventually, you understand the pattern. Across the room, his mother had left the window and was now accepting a coffee cup from Francis and saying something to Jeffrey's wife Patricia, who was responding with genuine animation, which meant Constance had said something kind. His mother was good at that when she chose to be, finding the exact right thing to say to make a person feel seen. It was a skill she used selectively, which made it powerful. James had rejoined the young woman on the sofa and was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, in the posture he adopted when he was genuinely interested in a conversation, rather than simply performing interest. Edward wondered for the first time who the young woman was, and how she knew the family, and whether James had any particular intention beyond the evening. And he filed this away as a question to ask later, at a moment when he had bandwidth for James's answer, and all the additions James would build onto it. The fire crackled. Francis removed the coffee tray. The conversation around the room settled into the quieter register that evening gatherings reached after a certain point, when the energy of arrival and dinner had been spent, and people were beginning to think, privately and without yet mentioning it, that it was probably approaching the time to start thinking about coats. Edward's phone, silent in his pocket, had not buzzed in the last 20 minutes, which meant Clara had received his message and was waiting, which she had said she would do, which she did, because that was the kind of person she was. He thought about the stars above the country lane. He thought about the manuscript in her bag that she had probably been trying to read by moonlight. He thought about the 12 pages she would have gotten through, and how she would tell him about those 12 pages on the drive home. Because she always wanted to share what she was reading, not to report it, but to think out loud about it with someone who was listening. He wanted very much to be in that car. He looked at the clock on the mantelpiece, 40 minutes left of the hour his mother had asked for. His mother, at that moment, looked across the room at him, and she gave him something he did not immediately have words for. Not a nod, not quite a smile, something smaller and more private than either. An acknowledgement, a continuation of the conversation in the hallway, conducted across a drawing room, in the language of people who had known each other long enough to mean things without saying them. He gave it back to her. Outside, the night was very still, and down the road, Clara waited, and the story of the evening was not the story anyone in this room had anticipated when they sat down to dinner. It was something else, something that had been reached by a longer and more honest route, and it was better for that, Edward thought, in the way that most things arrived at honestly were better. He finished his coffee. He thanked his grandmother. He stood up and said the usual things to the usual people, and found his coat on the hook by the front door and put it on. His mother was in the entrance hall when he reached it. She had come to see him out. He had not expected that either, but then this evening had consisted almost entirely of things he had not expected, which perhaps was the lesson in it somewhere. Go on then, she said. The pearls caught the light from the hallway sconce. Thank you, he said. He meant it for more than the permission to leave. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, she waited 3 hours. She did. That tells you something. I know, he said. It does. She opened the front door herself, which was a small gesture that meant something, and he walked through it into the cool autumn night, and the door closed behind him, and the gravel of the drive was loud under his feet, and then quieter, as he reached the grass at the edge of the road. And then he was walking in the dark with his hands in his coat pockets, and the stars overhead, and the east gate coming into view, and beyond it the road that curved away toward the place where a blue car was waiting, with a woman in it who had stayed. He walked faster. He heard the car before he saw it. A soft sound, nothing mechanical, just the shift of someone moving inside a vehicle, the small adjustment of a person who has been still for a long time and is changing position. He came around the curve of the lane where the hedgerow opened out a little and saw the blue car sitting at the edge of the verge, dark and quiet, with the narrow strip of sky above it absolutely full of stars. He walked to the passenger side and knocked on the glass. Clara's face appeared above the book she was holding, turned toward him, and he watched the expression cross her face in the moment before she reached to unlock the door. Relief, warmth, a very slight exasperation that was mostly just relief wearing a different coat. He opened the door and got in. The car was warm, from the heater she had clearly just turned on, and it smelled of her. The particular combination of the lotion she used, and the scent of paper, from whatever manuscript she carried everywhere, and something else, that he had never been able to name precisely, but that he associated entirely with the feeling of being in the right place. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She put the manuscript in her bag. "How was it?" He looked at her. The interior of the car was dim, lit only by the glow of the sky and the faint light from the dashboard, where the clock said 23:14. Her hair was dark and loose around her face, and her eyes were watching him with the patient, interested attention that he had noticed in the very first conversation they had ever had, and that had not once, in 7 months, stopped having an effect on him. "It was not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "An argument, or several arguments. The kind of evening you describe to people later as a difficult conversation, and leave it at that, because the full story takes too long." "And what did you get instead?" He thought about how to say it. He thought about the hallway, and his mother on the bench, and the things she had said about being willing to try. He thought about Eleanor in the drawing room, telling him that fear and love made a terrible combination, and that his mother had worked through a long process to reach the place she was standing. He thought about Francis, and the word decided. He thought about James staying at the table when the note said to leave, because James had understood that staying was the truer kind of help. "A conversation I didn't know I needed," he said finally. Clara looked at him for a moment and then nodded, not the nod of someone satisfied with a vague answer, but the nod of someone who has registered that the full story is coming, and is prepared to wait for it, in the same way she had been prepared to wait in this car for 3 hours in the cold. "Your mother was here," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." And it went. "Better than I thought," he said. "Significantly better." She took this in. Her hands were in her lap, the hands of someone who reads for both work and pleasure, and has done so since she was very young. He had noticed her hands early. He noticed them now. "She called me," Clara said. He turned to look at her. "About 20 minutes ago," Clara said. "She said she wanted me to know that the conversation you were going to have was not the one you were afraid of." Edward sat with this. "She called you," he said. "She did. From inside the house, while I was in the drawing room. Apparently." He thought about this for a moment. He thought about his mother standing at the drawing room window, looking out at the dark garden. He thought about her asking Francis for a coffee and saying something kind to Jeffrey's wife. He thought about her finding a moment in between all of that to step into the hallway and call the woman waiting down the road, to say the thing that needed saying to the right person. Something that was not quite a smile, and not quite the other thing, found its way onto his face. "That is," he said, "the most Constance thing I have ever heard." Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind she had, full and unguarded, and it filled the small car and made it feel like the right place to be, which it was. "I liked her," Clara said, "when I met her." He looked at her. "Tell me about that." She did. She told him about the Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago, when she had taken a half day from work on the pretext of a dentist appointment, and had instead taken the train to a small hotel in Bloomsbury, where she had arranged, through a series of careful and slightly nerve-wracking emails, to meet Constance Ashworth for afternoon tea. She had not told Edward. She had thought about telling him and decided against it, on the grounds that he would have tried to stop her, not because he did not want the meeting to happen, but because he would have wanted to control the conditions of it, to protect both of them from it going wrong. And sometimes, Clara had found, the things that needed to happen could not survive too much protection. She had arrived first. She had ordered tea. She had arranged herself in the chair and composed her face into something she hoped suggested confidence, rather than the precise opposite of confidence, which was what she was actually feeling. Constance had arrived exactly on time, which Clara had expected. She had sat down without elaborate greeting, which Clara had also expected. She had looked at Clara for a moment with the kind of looking that takes in a great deal of information very quickly, and then she had said, without preamble, "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Clara had said. "Why did you?" Clara had thought about several answers to this question on the train, and had discarded all of them in favor of the one that was simply true. "Because I care about your son," she had said, "and I didn't want the first time we met to be in a context where you had no choice about it." Constance had looked at her for a long time after that. Then she had poured tea and asked Clara what she did for work. They had talked for an hour and 20 minutes. It had not been easy, exactly. Constance was not an easy person, and there had been moments when the conversation had the quality of something navigating carefully between things it could not say yet, but it had been real. Clara had understood, by the end of it, that Edward's mother loved him in a way that was both enormous and slightly difficult, the way love sometimes was, when it had spent a long time without a clear object to attach itself to, and that the difficulty was not in the love itself, but in the way it occasionally became indistinguishable from control. She had understood also that Constance was aware of this, not fully, not yet, but enough to have come to a hotel in Bloomsbury, and have tea with a woman she had not chosen to meet. That counted for a great deal. Clara had decided it counted for everything necessary. She told Edward all of this. He listened in the dim car with the stars overhead and the clock reading 23:26, and he was very still in the way he was still when he was thinking hard, and she let him think. When she finished, he said, "She never told me. I asked her not to. I wanted you to have the evening without it." He looked at her. "You asked my mother to keep a secret from me." "I did." And she agreed. "She didn't tell you, did she?" He was quiet for a moment. "She told me tonight, actually. In the drawing room, at the end. She said you had come to her and asked her to let you make your own choice without pressure from you." Clara blinked. She was supposed to leave that part out. "Yes," he said, and now the thing that was almost a smile had become entirely a smile, and it looked the way it always looked on him, something that arrived slowly and then stayed. "She promised, apparently." "She did. And then she told me anyway." Clara shook her head, not in irritation, but in something closer to recognition. "That," she said, "is also the most Constance thing." They looked at each other for a moment in the warm, quiet car with the country night around them, and the particular silence between them was the kind that did not need filling, the kind that was itself a form of conversation. He reached across and took her hand. She turned her palm up to meet his. Outside, the stars were exactly as they had been all evening, patient and numerous above the hedgerows, doing what stars did, without any comment or adjustment, regardless of what was happening below them. "Take me home?" he said. She started the engine. The drive back toward the city took just under 2 hours, which was the right amount of time. Not so short that the evening arrived before they had finished talking about it, and not so long that the tiredness won before the conversation did. Clara drove, because she always drove when they were in her car. Not because Edward could not drive, but because she drove the way she read, with a kind of focused enjoyment that made it seem like a thing she was choosing, rather than something she was simply doing. And Edward sat in the passenger seat, with his head back against the headrest, and the window open by 2 inches, letting the cold night air come in just enough to keep him awake. He had told her most of it by the time they reached the motorway. His mother in the hallway, the conversation on the bench, the word "try," and what it had cost his mother to say it. The laugh in the entrance hall when he confirmed that Clara had been waiting since before dinner. Clara had listened to all of it the way she always listened, which was completely, without interrupting, without hurrying him toward the conclusion, before he was ready to reach it himself. "She sent you out herself," Clara said, when he had finished. "Opened the door." "Yes. That's her way of saying more than she said." "I know." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the road. The motorway was nearly empty at this hour, the lights of other cars occasional and distant. "I think," she said slowly, "that she has been afraid for a long time that you would choose something she couldn't follow you into, and tonight, she decided that being afraid of that was less important than actually being there." Edward thought about this. He thought about his mother coming to the dinner, with her decision already made, and her pearls already on, choosing the moment to come downstairs, opening the dining room door, and saying the words she had said, with the particular grace of someone who had decided that grace was more important than winning. "She's not there yet," he said. "Fully." "No," Clara agreed, "but she's facing the right direction." He looked at the side of her face. The lights of the motorway moved across it in slow, steady intervals. "What about you?" he asked. She glanced at him briefly, questioning. 3 hours in a car, in the cold, he said. "That's what I asked of you tonight, even if I didn't know that was what I was asking." "You asked me to wait," she said. "I can wait." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She was quiet for a moment. A lorry passed them on the outside lane, big and heavy, and briefly very loud. And then it was ahead of them, and the quiet came back. "I knew tonight was important," she said. "I knew it was the kind of evening where the way it went would matter past just the evening itself. I wasn't going to miss it by not being there." She paused, even if being there meant sitting in a lane for 3 hours in October. The heater was running. "Every 30 minutes, she confirmed. 10 on, 20 off. I was very disciplined about it." He laughed. It came from somewhere deep and real. The laugh he had, that she had come to recognize as the one that arrived when something found him in the place below the composure he wore in most other rooms. "I read 12 pages, she offered. "Were they good?" "The first sentences of the paragraphs were excellent. The rest of it, I'll need to look at again in better light." He shook his head. "What was it about?" "A man who restores old boats and thinks a great deal about impermanence, but not in a sad way. More like someone who has made peace with the fact that things need tending." He looked at her. "That sounds like something you'd have commissioned." "I didn't, actually. It came through the slush pile." She sounded pleased about this, in the particular way she sounded pleased when good things arrived unexpectedly, which was her preferred kind of good thing. "His sentences are exceptional. I think it might be the best thing we publish this year." "Tell him," Edward said, "when you write to him, tell him right away." "I always do," she said. "There's no point in making someone wait to hear that their work is good." He rested his head against the window glass, which was cool and slightly vibrating from the road. The city lights were beginning to appear at the edges of the sky, the particular orange-pink glow of a place where several million people were sleeping and a few were not, and Edward felt the familiar shift that the city always produced in him when he came back to it after being elsewhere, a kind of settling, like putting on a coat that fit. "My mother is going to want to meet you properly," he said, "not in a hotel in Bloomsbury, for tea arranged by you behind my back, properly." "I know," Clara said. "That will be its own kind of evening." "I imagine so." "You're not worried?" It was not a question, but she answered it like one. "No. I met her already, and she didn't unsettle me. The version of her I'll meet next time will be less defended than the version I met in Bloomsbury, which means she'll be easier, not harder." He considered this. "How do you know she'll be less defended?" "Because she opened the door," Clara said. "She already did the hardest part. Everything after that is slightly easier." He looked at the road. He thought about his mother's face in the entrance hall, and Eleanor's pale eyes in the drawing room, and James on the sofa leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and Francis moving through the room with the silver dish, with the economy of someone who had always understood exactly what was needed. "James stayed," he said. "I wrote him that note. Pretend you're ill, leave now, and he didn't. What did he do instead? He warned me about my mother, and then he stayed, and had coffee, and talked to someone on the other sofa, and was completely himself for the rest of the evening. Because that's what you actually needed, Clara said. Yes. Not someone to leave, she said. Someone to stay. He thought about that for a long time. They drove in the comfortable silence that the two of them had developed early. That specific ease of being in a moving vehicle with someone you did not need to entertain. The shared experience of passing through the same dark countryside together without commentary. The city was properly visible now, the lights brightening the lower edge of the sky, and Clara moved into the faster lane, and the engine settled into a higher note, and they were on the last stretch home. When we get in, she said, I'm making tea. Good, he said. And I want to hear more about your grandmother. You've barely mentioned her tonight, and she arranged the whole thing. Eleanor is a story on her own, he said. I know. That's why I want to hear it. He looked out at the city growing larger through the windscreen, the familiar skyline coming together piece by piece as they drove into it, and he thought about all the things that had happened in the last 4 hours, and how different they were from what he had walked into that dinner expecting. He thought about his mother saying try and meaning it. He thought about Eleanor saying decided with something that might have been approval. He thought about James staying, and Francis choosing exactly the right word, and the dining room clock ticking, and the fox crossing the garden in the moonlight. He thought about Clara in the blue car with the stars overhead, and 12 pages of a manuscript about a man who restored old boats, reading in the dark because reading in uncertain conditions was better than not reading at all. He thought about what it meant to be arrived somewhere, not at a destination, not at a conclusion, but at a place where things could begin properly, with honesty, and with the people who mattered, all facing the right direction, even if they were not yet all the way there. Thank you for waiting, he said. She looked at him briefly, just long enough to hold it. Always, she said. The city received them, warm and ordinary and full of lights. James Ashworth did not consider himself a person of particular consequence in the family drama. He was the cousin who showed up, said the useful thing, and retreated before the credit was handed out. He had occupied this role since childhood, and found it, on the whole, quite comfortable. There was no weight to it, no expectation of decision-making or public positioning, and it allowed him to observe things from a distance that the principal characters rarely got to observe them from. What he had observed this particular evening was enough to fill a very long letter, if he had been the kind of person who wrote long letters, which he was not. The morning after the dinner, he found himself at Eleanor's breakfast table with a cup of tea and the newspaper folded in front of him, which he was not reading, because his mind was still turning over the events of the previous night, with the particular rotation of someone who has been present at something, and is not yet sure what to call it. Eleanor came in at 8:30, as she always did, and sat in her chair at the head of the table, and Frances appeared with her habitual precision to deliver the same breakfast Eleanor had eaten every morning, for as long as James could remember. Eleanor picked up her own newspaper and read in silence for 6 minutes, which James knew because he timed it by the clock on the sideboard, which was his private habit at this table. At the end of 6 minutes, Eleanor put the newspaper down and looked at him. "You're thinking about last night," she said. "I am," he said. "What specifically?" He thought about how to answer this. With Eleanor, the most efficient approach was always the direct one. "I'm thinking about the note," he said. "The one Edward passed me under the table." "What did it say?" He had never told Eleanor about the note. He was faintly surprised that she was asking, which meant either she did not already know, or she was checking to see if his account matched what she already knew, and with Eleanor, it was genuinely impossible to tell which. It said, "Pretend you're ill, and leave now." Eleanor took a small, considered sip of tea. "And you stayed?" "I stayed." "Why?" He had been asking himself this question since the previous evening, and had arrived at an answer that he thought was correct, or at least honest. "Because leaving was the wrong kind of help," he said. "Edward didn't need someone to exit, he needed someone to remain. When there's something difficult happening at a table, having one fewer person there doesn't make the table less difficult, it makes it lonelier." Eleanor looked at him with the pale, measuring gaze that had never in his memory been unkind. "That was well reasoned. Thank you." "And correct," she added, which from Eleanor was almost effusive. She returned to her newspaper, read for another 30 seconds, put it down again. He texted the young woman before he came back to the drawing room. I assumed he did, James said. Good, Eleanor said, though whether the good was addressed to the texting or to James's assumption was unclear. She was there, I take it, waiting? Since before dinner, James said. 3 hours. Eleanor made a sound. Good woman. That's what I thought, James said. His phone, on the table beside his teacup, lit up with a message. He looked at it. It was from Edward, and it said, Home. All fine. Thank you for staying. James showed the screen to Eleanor without saying anything. She read it, nodded once, and returned to her breakfast. He typed back, Next time write a better note. Edward's reply came in 4 seconds. A single image, a photograph of 2 cups of tea on a kitchen counter, clearly taken that morning, with a book open on the surface beside them. Clara's book, he assumed, from the well-read spine, and the look of something that had been genuinely read, rather than simply owned. James smiled at the photograph for a moment, and then put his phone down and picked up his newspaper. Outside the dining room windows, the Ashworth estate was pale and clear in the autumn morning light. The garden that had been dark and still the night before was full of color now, the oak tree's leaves turning, the last of the late flowers holding on at the edges of the lawn. A bird was doing something energetic in the hedge near the east gate, its small industry entirely undisturbed by the events of the previous evening. Frances brought more tea. James thanked her. Eleanor read her newspaper. The estate breathed its morning breath, steady and old and indifferent to drama in the way that old places were, having accommodated too much of it over too many years to be particularly impressed. James thought about what Eleanor had said the previous evening, when he had passed her chair near the end of the coffee hour. He had been on his way to find his coat, and she had said, without looking up from the conversation she was having, You did the right thing tonight, James. Not about the note, not about staying, not specifying anything. Simply, you did the right thing. He had said thank you, and she had returned to her conversation, and that was the whole of it. It was, he had thought afterward, exactly the right amount of acknowledgement. Not too much, not ceremonious. Just a clear and private truth handed to him in the middle of an ordinary moment. He thought about Edward walking down the dark road toward the east gate. He thought about the coat Edward had taken from the hook, the sound of the front door closing, the gravel of the drive under his feet. He thought about the fact that Edward had looked, when he finally left, like someone moving toward something, rather than away from it, which was a distinction James had learned to notice, because in his experience, the two things looked almost identical from the outside, but felt entirely different from the inside. The young woman from the dinner, her name, he had finally learned during the coffee hour, was Sophie, and she was a landscape architect who had worked on several estates in the region, and had been invited by Eleanor on the recommendation of a mutual acquaintance, had said something to him near the end of the evening that he was still thinking about. They had been talking about the garden, specifically about the east corner where the planting had been slightly wrong for years, and everyone had noticed, but no one had done anything about it, and Sophie had said, without any particular emphasis, that the most common mistake in garden design was mistaking what was established for what was correct, that people left things a certain way, not because that way was working, but because it had been that way long enough that changing it felt like a loss, even when it was actually an improvement. He had thought, at the time, that she was talking about the garden. He was less sure of that now. He poured himself a second cup of tea and read his newspaper until Eleanor finished her breakfast and rose to attend to the particular business of a woman who had run a household for 6 decades and had many small consequential things to do before noon. When she passed his chair, she paused for a moment. I'll have Frances make up the blue room, she said. He looked up at her. For who? For Clara, Eleanor said, as though this were already settled, which it apparently was. I imagine we'll be having her for the weekend before long. Better to have the room ready. She moved toward the door. He watched her go, the straight back, the white hair, the comfortable authority of a woman who had decided something and was already 3 steps past the decision, into the practical arrangements. When, he said. She paused in the doorway without turning around. When Edward brings her, she said, which will be soon. Now that the difficult part is done, he won't want to wait long. A brief pause. Neither will she. She left. Her footsteps receded down the corridor, steady and unhurried. James sat alone at the breakfast table, with his tea, and the morning light coming through the old windows, and the garden outside doing its quiet autumn business. He thought about the note in his pocket. He still had it, the folded cream card with Edward's 4 words on the back, and he took it out and looked at it for a moment. Pretend you're ill, and leave now. He turned it over. His own name was on the front in printed script, as placed by Eleanor's housekeeper at the beginning of the evening. Edward Ashworth's handwriting was on the back, the small, careful letters of a man who had been trying not to be noticed, writing under a dinner table. He put it back in his pocket. He would give it to Edward at some point. It seemed like the kind of thing you kept. His phone buzzed again. He looked at it, and found not another message from Edward but one from Sophie, who had apparently obtained his number from Eleanor, in the same efficient way that Eleanor arranged most things. It said, "The east corner wants plants with good bones and silver leaves, low maintenance and long-lasting. Thought you might pass that along." He read it twice. He thought about it for a moment. Then he wrote back, "I'll mention it." He added, "The drawing room window faces that corner." A minute passed. Her reply came, "Good spot to watch it from." He put his phone down and looked out the window at the east corner in question, which was in fact visible from where he was sitting, and which was in fact slightly wrong in the way she had said, a little too crowded, a little too similar in everything, without the variety of structure and texture that made a planting genuinely interesting, rather than simply present. He made a note in his phone to mention it to Eleanor. Then he finished his tea and folded his newspaper and carried both to the kitchen, where Frances accepted them with the same measured efficiency with which she accepted all things, and he said good morning to her, and she said good morning to him, and he went upstairs to pack his bag for the drive back to the city. On the landing, passing the door of the blue room, the one Eleanor had just said she would have prepared, he paused for a moment and looked at it. It was a good room. Quiet, east-facing, the kind of room that was full of light in the mornings. He had stayed in it himself once, years ago, when the main guest rooms were occupied, and Eleanor had said the blue room would do very well. It would do very well. He went to pack his bag, and the house breathed around him, and somewhere in the city, 2 people were drinking tea in a kitchen, with a manuscript open on the counter, and the whole uncrowded rest of the day in front of them. The week after the dinner was ordinary, in most of the ways, that made weeks livable. Edward went to work. He sat at his desk and looked at the numbers that needed looking at, and talked to the people who needed talking to, and ate a sandwich at his desk on Tuesday, and a proper lunch with a colleague on Thursday, and came home each evening to his flat, which was quiet and familiar, and thought about what had changed and what hadn't. What had changed? His mother had called him on the Monday morning. Not a long call. Constance was not a long call person, but a real one, which was different from the careful ones they had been having for the last several months. She had asked how the drive home had been. She had asked, without any specific inflection, whether Clara had recovered from the cold. He had said yes. His mother had said good. There had been a pause, and then she had said, "I'd like to try a dinner, just the 4 of us, nothing large." He had said he would ask Clara. His mother had said fine. The call had ended, and he had sat with his phone in his hand for a moment, feeling the particular texture of a thing that had turned a corner. What had not changed? The flat was still quiet in the evenings. His books were still in the order he kept them. The habit of being careful was still in him, the long-trained instinct toward caution that did not dissolve overnight simply because one evening had gone better than expected. He understood this about himself. The careful was not all bad. It was also what made him reliable, what made him someone that people trusted with things that mattered. But it had started, somewhere in the last year, to feel like a room he was living in that was slightly too small, and he was ready to find a larger one. On the Wednesday, he called James. James answered on the second ring, which was typical. "How's Clara?" James said, before Edward could say anything. "Fine," Edward said. "Good. She's at work. I'm calling about something else." "What?" "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, rather than carefully." "I'm always honest," James said. "You're always diplomatic," Edward said, "which is not the same thing, and you know it." A brief pause. "Fair," James said. "What's the question?" "The note," Edward said. "Yes. You didn't do what it said." "No. I've been thinking about why. Edward said, "and I have a version of it, but I want to know your version." James was quiet for a moment. Edward heard the small ambient sounds of wherever James was, outdoors somewhere, or near an open window, with the particular layered sound that city air made when it came in from a street. "When I read the note," James said, "my first thought was to do exactly what it said. Get up, apologize to the table, say I had a migraine coming on. I'm known for migraines, it would have been entirely plausible, and walk out. Why didn't you?" "Because I thought about what you would be walking into afterward," James said. "If I left, then whatever happened in that room was just you and your family, and your mother, who had just arrived when you didn't expect her. And I thought, if the situation is difficult, the right move is usually not to reduce the number of people who care about you in the room. It's to stay and be one of the people who care about you." Edward said nothing. "Also," James said, "I thought the note was a reflex. You wrote it because you were rattled, and you wanted to move someone you cared about out of the way of something complicated. But the complicated thing was in your own head more than anywhere else." "That's accurate," Edward said. "I know." A pause. "How is your mother?" "She called Monday morning," Edward said. "She wants to do a dinner, the four of us." "That's fast," James said. "She's decided," Edward said. "When she decides, she moves." "Like Eleanor." "Yes," Edward said, "exactly like Eleanor." "And Clara?" "She said yes immediately," Edward said. "She's not unsettled by Constance. She went to meet her in Bloomsbury 3 weeks ago, without telling me, and sat with her for an hour and a half, and apparently held her own." James was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I like her very much." "I know," Edward said. "So do I." Another pause. The friendly, easy pause of two people who know each other well enough to let the conversation settle. "I still have the note," James said. "I know you do," Edward said. "I noticed you put it in your pocket." "Do you want it back?" Edward thought about it. "Keep it," he said. "I'd rather it existed as something I remember than something I have to look at." "That's the most Edward thing you've ever said." "Probably." James laughed, and Edward smiled at his own wall, and they talked for another 15 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the dinner, or Constance, or any of it. About James's work, which involved a project he was quietly energized by. About a restaurant they had both been meaning to try. About a book James had read that he thought Edward would like, and then said goodbye the way old friends said goodbye, without ceremony, simply by agreeing that it had been a good conversation, and that they would talk again soon. Edward put the phone on his desk and looked at the window. The afternoon light was moving in the particular way October afternoon light moved, low and gold, crossing the floor in a slow diagonal as the day shifted. He watched it for a moment. He thought about Clara at work, in the office she described as slightly too small and entirely too full of paper, sitting across from someone else's manuscript and doing the thing she did, finding the center of it, understanding what the writer was actually trying to say. He thought about her reading 12 pages in the dark in a country lane and calling them promising. He thought about his mother in the hallway on the bench, saying try. He thought about Eleanor in the drawing room, saying decided. He thought about James on the phone just now, saying stay and be one of the people who care about you in the room. He thought about the 4-word note he had written under the table in the middle of a dinner that had seemed impossible, and how the most important thing about those 4 words was that they had not been followed. Pretend you're ill and leave now. He had written it out of the reflex to protect, out of the well-worn habit of managing things so that they stayed in the category of manageable. And James had put it in his pocket and stayed at the table, and Edward had walked back into the room after his conversation with his mother, and Constance had opened the front door herself, and Clara had waited in the cold with a manuscript and the radio on low, and none of it had followed the plan, and all of it had turned out better than the plan. He pulled a piece of paper toward him on the desk. He kept paper, actual paper, which most of his colleagues found either quaint or inexplicable, and wrote something on it. Not a note to anyone, just something he wanted to have said, even if only to himself. The things that matter usually require someone to stay. He looked at it for a moment, then he put his pen down and went to make tea. Clara's flat in Islington occupied the upper floor of a narrow Victorian terrace, and contained, by her own generous estimate, more books than was strictly reasonable for one person, and one cat. The books were everywhere. On the dedicated shelves that covered 2 full walls of the sitting room, on the smaller shelves in the bedroom and the hallway and the bathroom, in stacks on the floor beside her desk, that she kept meaning to address and never quite got to, because the system of stacks had developed its own logic over time, and disturbing it felt risky. Her colleague Mia had once counted the stacks during a visit and reached 47 before losing track, and had said, "Clara, this is a library with a stove," and Clara had taken this as a compliment. Norman the cat, a large, gray, deliberately unimpressed animal who had come with the flat and had apparently decided to stay indefinitely, occupied the warmest spot in any room at any given time, which in October meant the armchair nearest the radiator in the sitting room, from which he observed visitors with the expression of a customs official who has seen everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. He had, as Edward had correctly reported, decided that Edward was acceptable. This was not a small thing. Norman had declined to accept most people who had come through the flat in the past 3 years, had left 2 of them in no doubt about his feelings through the simple method of sitting with his back to them for the duration of their visit, and had once caused a former colleague of Clara's to describe the experience as being silently assessed by a large gray committee. But he had looked at Edward on his first visit, assessed him for approximately 45 seconds, and then walked across the room and sat directly on his feet, which Norman only did with people he intended to tolerate long-term. Clara had told Edward, at the time, that Norman had good instincts about people. Edward had said he was glad to have passed. Norman had continued to sit on his feet with the air of someone who had done a significant favor and expected it to be remembered. It was a Friday evening now, 6 days after the dinner, and Clara was sitting at her desk with the manuscript about the boat restorer open in front of her, making notes in the margins, in her characteristic small handwriting, that Mia said resembled the notation system of a medieval scholar. The notes were good. The author's name was Philip, and he had a gift she did not encounter often enough, the gift of making the ordinary feel essential, without ever announcing that it was doing so. His sentences moved forward quietly, and then you reached the end of one and realized it had taken you somewhere you had not seen coming. She had written in the margin of page 47, "This is the book's heart. Everything leads here." Edward was in the kitchen, which was the other room in the flat where Norman had decided he was permitted. She could hear the sound of the kettle, and then the sound of cupboard doors, and then a pause that she knew, without looking, meant Edward was reading the front of the packet of biscuits she had bought on Tuesday, and then wondering whether she had intended them to be eaten. "The biscuits are for eating," she called. "How did you know that's what I was looking at?" he called back. "Informed guess," she said. He appeared in the doorway, with 2 cups of tea, and the biscuits on a plate, and Norman lifted his head from the armchair and assessed the situation, and then put his head down again, satisfied that the biscuits did not require his attention. Edward set the tea on the corner of her desk, carefully avoiding the manuscript, and looked at the page she was on. "Good," he said. "The best thing I've read in 2 years," she said. "Maybe longer." She clicked her pen. "How was the call with your mother?" He had told her about the call on Monday evening. She was asking about the follow-up call, the one she knew he had been planning for Thursday, the one that would begin the actual arrangements for the dinner his mother had proposed. "Productive," he said. He sat on the edge of the sofa, Norman's territory, but the cat allowed him even this, and wrapped his hands around his tea. "She wants to do it at her flat, not a restaurant. I think she wants the comfort of home for it." "That makes sense," Clara said. "She asked what you don't eat." Clara looked at him. "She asked that." "She did." A slight smile. "I said I didn't know," which is true. She said she'd assumed I didn't know, and that I should find out. "Right." Clara thought about this. "I don't eat mushrooms. Everything else is fine." That's genuinely the entire list? Norman is the particular one in this flat. "I eat almost anything." He made a note on his phone. "She'll appreciate that. She's a good cook when she decides to be, which she doesn't always decide to be, but for something like this she will." "When?" Clara said. She suggested the 3rd Saturday of next month, which gives everyone time to settle into the situation, as she put it. Clara nodded. She turned back to the manuscript for a moment, read a sentence, and wrote a question in the margin. Then she put the pen down and picked up her tea. "Are you nervous about it?" Edward asked. She thought about this honestly. "No," she said. "I'm interested. There's a difference." He looked at her. "You said that about us once. In the beginning." "I remember. At Lucy's dinner. When you talked about maps for 40 minutes, she said. 20, he said. Mia said 40, Clara said. I'm inclined to trust Mia." He shook his head. Outside, the Friday evening street was doing what Friday evening streets in Islington did, filling up, growing warm with it, the particular energy of a week ending, and people moving toward the things they had been looking forward to since Tuesday. "My grandmother wants to have you for the weekend," Edward said. "Not immediately," she said before long, which with Eleanor means she's already had Frances prepare the room. Clara looked at him. "Your grandmother." "Eleanor." "Yes. She arranged the entire dinner. She arranges most things," he said. "She doesn't announce it, which is part of why it works." Clara considered this. She had not yet met Eleanor Ashworth, but she had formed a picture of her from everything Edward had said, and hadn't said, the particular gaps in his descriptions being as informative as the descriptions themselves. "I'd like to meet her," she said. "She'd like to meet you," he said. "She has a room ready." They sat in the comfortable Friday evening quiet, the tea warm, the manuscript in front of her, Norman in the armchair, the sounds of the street coming in under the window. "You know," Clara said, after a moment, "the night of the dinner, when I was sitting in the car, after your message came, your mother called." "I know," he said. "You told me. I told you that she called, and what she said. I didn't tell you the part that I keep thinking about." He looked at her. "She said, she's been patient this long." Clara paused. Not as criticism, just as a fact. And then she said, "That tells you something." She picked up her tea. "And I thought, she said the same thing to you." At the door, she said Clara waited 3 hours, "and that tells you something." He was quiet. "I think," Clara said, "that she was testing something. Not me, exactly. Not you, exactly. More like testing the idea of us, seeing if it held when examined." "Did it?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "What do you think?" He looked back at her with the particular look he had, the one that arrived when he had thought about something long enough to be sure of it. "Yes," he said. "Then there's your answer," she said, and picked up her pen and turned back to the manuscript. Norman shifted in the armchair, resettled, and went back to sleep. The street continued its Friday business outside. Philip's manuscript continued being the best thing she had read in 2 years. The third Saturday of the following month arrived on a morning that was clear and dry and cold, in the way October became November, the air carrying a quality that was different from autumn, sharper, more definite, as though the season had finally made up its mind. Clara stood in front of her wardrobe for longer than she usually stood in front of her wardrobe, and then chose the navy coat she always felt confident in, and put it on over the gray dress she had bought the previous spring, and wore for things that mattered. Edward arrived at 11:30. He was wearing his dark jacket and the scarf she had given him in September, when the weather had first turned, and he looked the way he looked when he was preparing himself for something. A particular straightness in how he stood, a quietness that was not absence, but presence. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. She picked up the flowers she had bought the day before, white and green, quiet and elegant. The kind of flowers that said, "We have taken care with this," without saying anything about how much care. And they took the tube, and then walked the last 10 minutes through streets that were Saturday morning, full and ordinary. And then they were in front of a building Clara had not been to before, a well-maintained block in a quiet part of the city, and Edward buzzed the entry, and a voice she recognized from the phone said, "Come up," in the controlled, composed tone of a woman who was entirely ready. The flat was on the 4th floor. The corridor was carpeted and quiet. Edward knocked. He did not use a key, which Clara noted, and the door opened. Constance Ashworth was shorter than Clara had remembered from Bloomsbury, or perhaps it was simply that she had been sitting then and was standing now, and the standing version filled a doorway differently than the sitting version filled a hotel chair. She was wearing dark trousers and a cream blouse, and no pearls today, which felt like a deliberate choice, in the same way the pearls at the dinner had been a deliberate choice. And her expression was the carefully composed one Clara had seen before, but underneath it, was something she had also seen before. A person who was working at something. Working at openness. Working at being the right version of herself for this particular moment. Clara held out the flowers. Constance looked at them for a moment. Then she took them, and something in her face shifted, very slightly, toward the softer side of the expression. "Come in," she said. The flat was warm and smelled of cooking. Whatever Constance had made involved something that was slow and careful, and the smell of it carried the consideration of someone who had thought about what to prepare. Clara noticed the books on the shelves in the sitting room. She always noticed books, and the photograph on the sideboard, that was Edward, at perhaps 10 or 11, serious-faced and holding something that appeared to be a very large stick, with the expression of someone who had found something important. She looked at Edward. "Scout camp," he said, quietly. She smiled. She did not say anything. They sat in the sitting room, while Constance put the flowers in water and brought out coffee, and the particular small biscuits that Clara would later learn were Constance's way of marking occasions she took seriously. The conversation began in the way most conversations between people who care about making a good impression began. Carefully, with topics that were safe, the kind that allowed everyone to find their footing before anyone moved toward the things that mattered more. Constance asked Clara about her work, not politely, specifically. She had clearly done some reading, or perhaps some thinking, because her questions were not the surface questions people asked about publishing when they did not know much about it. They were the questions of someone who had thought about what publishing actually required, the judgment involved, the relationship between a writer and an editor, the particular difficulty of knowing what a book needed when the writer themselves did not yet know. Clara answered honestly and found, as she had found in Bloomsbury, that Constance was someone who listened well when she chose to, and today she was choosing to. Edward sat beside her and said relatively little, which was his way in conversations where someone else was doing the important talking, and which Clara appreciated, because it meant she was not having to manage two conversations at once. At some point, the lunch was ready, and they moved to the table. The food was good. The conversation, by that point, had loosened enough that the food could be commented on without that comment seeming like an excuse to stop talking, which was the specific difficulty of early meals with new people. Constance had made a slow-cooked dish with lentils and root vegetables that was warm and careful, and exactly right for a November afternoon. Clara said so. Constance looked at her and said, "I'm glad," and the way she said it was simple and without performance, and it was the closest she came, that afternoon, to anything that could be called warmth without the armor. After lunch, while Edward was in the kitchen helping with the plates, a task Constance had directed him to with the specific efficiency of a woman who wanted 2 minutes alone with someone, Constance looked at Clara across the table and said, quietly and without preamble, "He is happier." Clara met her gaze. "I hope so." "It's not a hope," Constance said. "It's an observation." She paused. "I observe things about my son. I have been observing things about him for 31 years. In the last 7 months he has been different. More like himself." She paused again, and Clara could see the effort in it, the work of saying a thing that cost something to say. "I wanted you to know that I have noticed that," Clara said. "Thank you for telling me." "I'm not entirely easy," Constance said. "I want you to know that too. I'm not going to suddenly be easy, but I'm willing to try." I said that to him, and I mean it, and I wanted to say it to you as well directly. "That's all anyone needs to try," Clara said. "The willingness." Constance looked at her for a moment. Then she said something that surprised Clara enough that she did not respond immediately. "You came to Bloomsbury," she said. 3 weeks before that dinner. Without him knowing, you sat with me for an hour and a half, and you were composed and honest, and you didn't once try to convince me of anything. You just asked me to let him choose." She paused. "I've thought about that a great deal." "I hope it was the right thing to do," Clara said. "It was," Constance said simply. "It was the right thing, and it was also a brave thing, and I don't give credit lightly, but I'm giving it now, because you earned it." Edward came back from the kitchen at that moment, and something in the quality of the air between the two women made him stop briefly in the doorway and look at them both. Clara glanced at him. He looked back with the question in his eyes that she answered with the smallest possible nod. "It's all right." He came and sat down. Constance offered coffee. The afternoon settled into something that was not the formal, careful thing it had begun as, but something less defended, more real. The kind of afternoon that could only exist after a harder one had already happened. They talked about things that were not weighted, about the estate and Eleanor, about a trip Constance had taken the previous year, that she described with dry precision and more ease than she usually permitted herself, about Clara's brother Will, whom she mentioned once in passing, and whom Constance asked a question about, with what appeared to be genuine interest. When they left, 2.5 hours later, Constance stood at the door, and did not do the thing Edward had half expected, which was to say something formal and concluded. Instead she said, to Clara, "The flowers are very nice," and to Edward, "Call me Tuesday," and then she closed the door. They walked down the corridor to the lift. Edward pressed the button. "How was that?" he said. "Good," Clara said. And then, "Better than good." "She told you something," he said, "in the 2 minutes when I was in the kitchen. She said you're happier." He looked at the lift door. "She notices things about you," Clara said. "She's been noticing them for 31 years. "I know," he said. The lift arrived. They got in. The doors closed. "She's not easy," Clara said. "No. But she's trying." "Yes," he said, "she is." The lift descended through the quiet building, and outside the November afternoon was doing what November afternoons did, going dark early, the sky taking on that particular deep blue quality of early winter evenings in the city, the streetlights coming on in the way they did when the day had decided it was finished. They walked back toward the tube in the early dark, and the city moved around them, and the afternoon sat in Clara's memory, with the weight of something that had been difficult, and had been worth the difficulty, and would continue to be both of those things, in ways that could not yet be entirely seen, but were present, visible around the edges, like light behind a door that has not yet opened all the way. Eleanor Ashworth had a method for preparing a guest room that she had developed over many years of having the kind of house where people came to have important conversations, and it began 3 days in advance. The room was aired, the linens were changed, the flowers on the small table by the window were replaced with fresh ones, and the lamp by the reading chair was checked to make sure the bulb was strong enough to read by without strain. Eleanor believed that a room that was genuinely ready for a person was a form of welcome that preceded any words, and she took it seriously. The blue room at the estate had been used, over the years, for cousins and old friends, and one visiting academic who had come to use the estate library and stayed for 6 weeks in what was supposed to be a fortnight. It was east-facing, as James had noted, and in the mornings it was full of early light that fell across the old wooden floors in long, pale rectangles and made the room look like something out of a painting. She had told Frances to prepare it for the weekend that Edward had mentioned in his phone call, which had come on a Tuesday evening while Eleanor was having her usual small supper in the kitchen. "She's an editor," Eleanor had said, when Frances asked, as she invariably did, whether there was anything specific to know about the guest. "Books?" Frances had said. "Books," Eleanor had confirmed. Frances had nodded with the expression of someone filing a useful piece of information, and the next day, Eleanor had found that the small bookshelf in the blue room had been added to. 3 titles she recognized as having received serious attention from serious people over the past year, placed carefully alongside the usual Ashworth collection of slightly elderly novels, and the one very good history of the county that had been there for decades. Frances had a habit of reading reviews, and she had apparently been paying attention. Eleanor had looked at the 3 new books and felt something she recognized as quiet satisfaction. That was exactly right. The weekend arrived on a Friday evening in November, when the estate was at its particular autumn best. The oak tree stripped now, and very tall against the pale sky. The garden held in the specific stillness that came before the real cold. Edward drove. He had called Eleanor the Sunday before to confirm the arrangements, and she had said simply, "Good," and given him the time for dinner, and they had both understood that the rest of the details were in capable hands. Clara, sitting in the passenger seat as the city gave way to the countryside and the roads narrowed and the darkness deepened, held the manuscript of Philip's boat book on her lap, though she was not reading it. She was looking at the road, at the headlights picking out the hedgerows on either side, at the occasional gateway into a dark field, at the stars that were beginning to appear in the parts of the sky not covered by cloud. She thought about the country lane, the car parked on the verge, the 3 hours, the stars above the narrow gap of sky between the hedges. "Are you nervous?" Edward said. "Interested," she said. He smiled at the road. "Right." The estate gate appeared, and he turned through it, and the gravel drive crunched under the tires, and the house came into view with its windows lit, and the particular quality of a large old building that was expecting people. Francis opened the door before they reached it, because Francis always knew when a car was on the drive. "Mr. Ashworth," she said. "Miss Carter." "Good evening, Francis," Clara said. Francis looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was something adjacent to approval, the look of someone who has formed an expectation and found it confirmed. "Good evening," she said. "I'll show you to the blue room." Eleanor was in the sitting room, in her chair, with a book in her lap that she set aside when they came in. She rose, slowly, but fully, declining the assistance of the arm of the chair, with a slight movement that suggested the offer had not been necessary. She looked at Clara for a moment with the pale, measuring gaze. Clara stood still and let herself be looked at, because she had understood by now that the important people in Edward's life were people who noticed things, and the correct response to being noticed was to be genuinely present rather than performing presence. "Sit down," Eleanor said, not unkindly, simply directly, the way someone spoke when they were comfortable in a room and expected others to be comfortable in it too. They sat. Eleanor asked Clara what she thought of the drive from the city. Clara said she had found it beautiful, and meant it, and said specifically what she had found beautiful: the way the sky had widened as the roads narrowed, the particular quality of darkness in the countryside that was different from city darkness, the stars that were not visible in the city, and were very visible here. Eleanor listened to this with the expression of someone who had lived with those stars for decades, and was pleased to find they were still worth describing. "The blue room is comfortable," Eleanor said. "There's a lamp by the reading chair that Francis tells me is adequate." "Thank you," Clara said. "That's very thoughtful." "Francis chose 3 books for the shelf," Eleanor said. "I don't know if any of them are to your taste." "I'll read anything that someone has thought to choose," Clara said. Eleanor looked at her. "Good answer," she said. They had dinner in the dining room, not the full formal production of the previous occasion, but something quieter and more genuine, the 3 of them at one end of the long table, with Francis moving in and out with the ease of long practice. The food was different from Constance's careful lunch, more comfortable, the food of a house that had been feeding people seriously for a very long time. Eleanor ate with good appetite, and talked with the particular directness of a person who had long since decided that at 81, there was no point in being indirect. She asked Clara about Philip's book without naming it, because Edward had mentioned it and Eleanor had a habit of preparing for conversations the way she prepared guest rooms. Clara described it, and Eleanor listened, and asked 2 questions that demonstrated she understood something about the difficulty of the subject: impermanence, the necessity of tending things, and Clara found herself expanding into the conversation in the way she expanded when someone was genuinely interested. Edward was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was content. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room, and Francis brought tea, and Eleanor asked a question that was not quite a question. "You've met Constance," she said. "Yes," Clara said, "twice now." "How is she?" Clara considered this for a moment. "She's trying," she said. Eleanor nodded, as though this confirmed something. "She was afraid," she said. "For a long time. Fear makes people behave in ways that look like they're protecting someone, when really they're protecting themselves." She paused. "She loves him very much." "I know," Clara said. "And you don't find that difficult," Eleanor said. "Not a question." "No," Clara said. "Someone who loves him very much is someone I'd like to know." Eleanor looked at her with the pale eyes, and was silent for a moment. Then she said, with the particular quality of someone delivering a verdict they have considered carefully, "I think you'll do." Clara heard Edward, beside her, make a sound that was almost laughter. "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me," Eleanor said. "It's simply an observation." She reached for her tea. "James tells me you know about the note." "I do," Clara said. "The one he didn't follow." "The one he didn't follow." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire, which was burning low and comfortable in the old fireplace. He has always been the one who stayed, she said. James, even as a child, when something difficult happened, Edward would become very still, and James would simply remain in the room, doing whatever he had been doing, being present in the ordinary way. It was his particular gift. She paused. Some people protect by removing themselves. Some protect by staying. James has always known the difference, Edward said quietly. He told me the note was a reflex, that leaving was the wrong kind of help. He was right, Eleanor said. It was. The fire crackled. Outside, the November night was very still, the kind of still that only happened in the countryside in deep autumn, when the trees were bare, and the wind had died, and the darkness was complete, and the world was very present in its quietness. Clara looked around the room, the low shelves, the old rugs, the photographs along the mantelpiece, the particular accumulated weight of a place where many things had happened, and many people had sat and talked and been present in exactly the way they were being present now. She thought about what Eleanor had said. Some people protect by removing themselves. Some protect by staying. She thought about the country lane. She had stayed. She had sat in the cold in the dark, and she had read 12 pages in uncertain light, and she had answered the phone when it rang, and she had waited. Because waiting was the true thing to do. Because the true thing was always the thing that kept you present, rather than the thing that let you off. There's a question I've been wanting to ask, Clara said. Eleanor looked at her with permission in the look. That dinner, Clara said. You arranged it. I arrange most things, Eleanor said. Did you know, when you arranged it, that something significant was going to happen? Or did you simply arrange a family dinner, and the rest of it came with it? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled. The clock on the mantelpiece marked several seconds. I knew, Eleanor said finally, that something needed to happen. Whether it would happen at dinner, or because of dinner, or in spite of dinner, I didn't know. I arranged the conditions. What happened in the conditions was up to the people in them. And you invited Constance, Edward said. Your mother invited herself, Eleanor said, calmly. I simply didn't discourage her. A pause. And you had Frances prepare the blue room before you'd invited anyone, Edward said. Eleanor looked at him serenely. I had the room prepared because I thought it would eventually be needed, she said. I don't see the point in being surprised by the things you have anticipated. Clara looked at Eleanor Ashworth, in her chair by the fire in her old house, 81 years old and entirely undefeated, and she thought, here is a woman who has been paying attention her whole life and has understood something the rest of us are still working out. I think, Clara said, that you are the most remarkable person I've met. Eleanor did not look particularly surprised by this. The night is young, she said. You may revise your opinion. But she was pleased. Clara could see it in the quality of her stillness, which was different from composed. It was the stillness of a person who has received something they considered to be truthful, and has decided to accept it. They sat until the fire burned low, and Frances appeared to ask whether anyone needed anything else, and Eleanor said good night, and she rose and left the room, with the same straight back and the same unhurried steps, and Frances turned off one of the lamps and left the remaining one burning low, and Edward and Clara sat for a while in the warm, dim sitting room, with the estate breathing around them. She knew, Edward said, after a moment. She always knew, Clara said. She arranged the conditions and waited for the people in them to do the work. Like a good editor. Clara looked at him. Exactly like a good editor, she said. He reached across and took her hand in the way he had taken it in the car on the dark country lane on the night of the dinner, and outside the November night was deep and still, and full of stars that required darkness to become visible, and the blue room upstairs had a lamp that was adequate for reading, and 3 books on the shelf that someone had thought to choose, and the morning was a long time away still, and there was no need yet to be anywhere other than exactly here. The last morning of the weekend arrived the way good mornings at old houses arrived, quietly, with light. Clara woke to the east-facing window already pale with early sun, the long rectangles of it across the floor, exactly as she had imagined they would be from Edward's descriptions. She lay still for a moment and looked at them, because they were worth looking at. The room was everything Frances had prepared it to be, quiet and warm and thought about. The 3 books on the shelf caught the morning light. Norman was not there, because Norman was in Islington, in the armchair by the radiator. but the quality of the morning had something of Norman's particular seriousness about it. The feeling of being in a place that took itself seriously, and expected the people in it to do the same. She got up and put on the warm cardigan she had brought for mornings, and opened the curtains all the way, and the garden below was extraordinary in the early light. The bare oak tree massive and clear against the sky, the last of the autumn color in the borders at the edges of the lawn, the whole of it still and clear, and carrying the quality of a thing seen for the first time, even when it was not. She sat in the reading chair by the window, with one of the books Francis had chosen, and read until the smell of breakfast reached her from somewhere below. Downstairs, Eleanor was already at the table, newspaper in hand, in exactly the position Clara had now heard described from James, and from Edward himself, and which was exactly as they had described it. The straight back, the measured calm, the sense of a person who had been up for a while, and had already done several things before anyone else appeared. She looked up when Clara came in. "Good morning," Clara said. "Good morning," Eleanor said. "Sit down. Francis will be along." Francis was along in the time it took Clara to pour tea from the pot that was already on the table, and the breakfast was the exact kind of breakfast that old houses produced when they were being themselves: eggs and bread, and a particular marmalade that had clearly been in the family for some time based on the label's vintage. Edward appeared 20 minutes later, with the comfortable, slightly unhurried quality of someone who slept deeply when he slept well, which he did when he was somewhere he felt settled. He sat down, poured tea, ate without much preamble, and gradually became more present. Eleanor observed this process with the look of someone who had watched a great many people become present over breakfast. "Did you sleep?" she said to Clara. "Extremely well," Clara said. "The room is perfect." Eleanor made a sound of quiet satisfaction. "Francis chose the mattress in 1987, and refuses to allow it to be changed," she said. "She is correct not to allow it." "She's correct about most things," Edward said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She is. I've told her so on several occasions." She appears unmoved by the acknowledgement, which is how you know it's genuine. Clara ate her marmalade toast and looked out the window at the garden in the morning light, and felt something she recognized as the feeling of being somewhere that had decided to include her. Not effortlessly, there was effort in it, on everyone's part, the particular effort of people who were choosing to do something new, but genuinely, and the effort made it more real, rather than less. After breakfast, Eleanor said she had several things to attend to, and left them to it, with the straightforward efficiency of someone who had said what needed to be said, and now had other things to do. Francis cleared the table. Edward and Clara put on their coats and went into the garden. The morning was cold and clear and bright. Their breath showed in the air. The garden was large and slightly formal near the house, and then more natural as it moved outward toward the wall, and the variety of it, the careful and the grown, was interesting in the way all things were interesting, that had developed over time, rather than been designed all at once. They walked along the path that ran beside the east wall, where the planting was the kind that had been there long enough to become established, though she noticed, as Sophie had noticed, that it was slightly too similar in texture and structure, a little lacking in the variation that made a planting genuinely alive, rather than simply present. She did not say this because it was not the morning for horticulture. The morning was for walking and talking, and they did both, in the particular comfortable way that had become their natural register, not performing the walk or performing the talk, simply doing both, in the unhurried way of people who had time and were choosing to spend it exactly here. Edward told her about summers here as a child, the way the estate had felt enormous then, the specific places he had gone to be alone, a spot near the garden wall where there was a low branch of the oak that was exactly the right height for sitting on and looking at things. He had spent what felt like entire afternoons on that branch, he said, reading or thinking or doing nothing in particular, which was a thing he did not do enough of anymore, and had not found a replacement for. "You could still sit on the branch," Clara said. He looked at it. The branch was still there, low and broad and reaching toward the garden in the same direction it had always reached. He looked at it with the expression he wore when he was considering something seriously that he might ordinarily consider too simple to take seriously. She smiled. They reached the far end of the garden and stood for a moment at the old stone wall that marked the boundary. Beyond it, the countryside continued, fields in the morning light, brown and pale and very quiet. "I want to tell you something," Edward said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the fields, but she could see his face, in the particular way she had learned to read it, the way that indicated he had been thinking about something for long enough that he was ready to say it and was now preparing the words. She waited. The last year, he said, before the dinner, before any of this, I had been doing the careful thing for so long that I had stopped noticing I was doing it. Every decision went through the same process. What's the right move? What's the outcome? How do I manage this so it stays in the category of manageable? He paused. And then I met you. And the careful thing kept telling me to slow down, to not let it become too significant, to protect myself against the possibility that it would get complicated. He paused again, and the uncomplicated part of me kept not listening. She looked at him. I'm glad, he said, that it didn't listen. She took his hand. He turned to look at her. I'm glad too, she said simply. The morning light was very bright across the fields, and the garden was still, and somewhere behind them, the old house stood in the way it had always stood, solid and east-facing, and full of things that had happened in it, and things that were still to come. The branch, Clara said, after a moment. He looked at her. Go sit on the branch, she said. I'll watch. He looked at her with the expression that was the particular version of the almost smile, the one that arrived when something pleased him, and he was still deciding whether to admit it. Then he turned and walked back along the path to the oak tree. The branch was exactly as he had described, low and broad, reaching out toward the garden at a height that was accessible in the way it had been when he was a child, not much higher than his waist. He stood beside it for a moment, then put his hands on it and lifted himself up, the way you did when you had done something before and the body remembered the motion, and he sat on the branch with his feet hanging and looked at the garden. Clara stood on the path and watched him. He looked very still, not the careful still, the managed still, the other kind, the kind she had seen only a few times, the kind that meant he was actually resting, actually present in the moment without being ready to respond to the next thing. She stayed where she was and let him have it. After a few minutes he looked up and found her on the path. It's exactly the same, he said. Good, she said. He sat on the branch for another few minutes, looking at the garden in the morning light, and she stood on the path in the cold air, and the estate was quiet around them, and the week that had led here, the dinners, the hallways, the dark country lane, the pearls, the blue room, the marmalade, settled into place the way things settled when they had been through enough to know where they belonged. When he got down from the branch, they walked back toward the house together, and the breakfast dishes had been cleared, and Francis was in the garden, doing something with the beds near the south wall, and Eleanor was visible through the library window, working at her desk with the straight-backed concentration of someone for whom work was a form of presence. The house received them as they came in through the back door, warm from the kitchen, the smell of the morning still in the air. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. It had taken a dinner, and a dark road, and a handwritten note that was not followed, and a telephone call from a woman in pearls, and a cup of tea in Bloomsbury, and an hour and a half on a bench in a hallway, and a car on a country lane in the cold, and all the small careful things that people did for each other when they were trying to do the right thing in complicated circumstances. It had taken all of that to get here. And here was a house with morning light on old floors, and a garden with a branch that had been there for decades, and a table being set by someone who chose things with care, and two people who had found, by the longer and more honest route, that the things worth having were always the ones that had required, at some point, someone to stay.